Every dollar in your pocket and every financial crisis of the last century can be traced back to one man. A man who was sentenced to hang for murder, only to become the most powerful banker on earth. He didn't just invent paper money, he turned the wealthiest nation in Europe into a gargantuan casino, where the stakes were nothing less than the future of civilization. Meet John Law, the gambler who taught the world how to bet on a lie. Imagine a world where gold is a lie. For thousands of years, humanity was shackled to the weight of metal. If you couldn't touch it, melt it, or lock it in a cold iron chest, it didn't exist. Wealth was heavy. Wealth was limited. And because of that, empires were brittle. But in the early 1700s, a man stepped out of the shadows of a London prison and offered the world a dangerous, seductive alternative. He promised that wealth wasn't a thing you could hold, it was an idea you could believe in. He promised that paper could be gold. His name was John Law. To some, he was the greatest economic visionary who ever lived, the father of the modern financial system. To others, he was a cold-blooded murderer, a reckless gambler, and the architect of the greatest financial catastrophe the world had ever seen. He took the wealthiest nation in Europe, France, and turned it into a gargantuan casino. This is the story of the architect of chaos. John Law was born in 1671 in Edinburgh, the son of a wealthy goldsmith. Law possessed a terrifying gift. He could see the invisible threads of probability. While other children played, John Law was dissecting the mathematics of chance. By the time he reached London, he was the personification of the high-stakes lifestyle. Tall, handsome, and cold. In 1694, a dispute over a woman led to a duel. Law, with clinical precision, killed his opponent instantly. He was sentenced to hang but escaped using a bribe and smuggled files. For the next decade, he wandered from Amsterdam to Venice, haunted the most exclusive casinos, and studied how silver moved and how credit flowed. He realized that Europe was a Ferrari stuck in second gear because it didn't have enough fuel. And John Law was about to invent the fuel. In 1715, the Sun King, Louis XIV, lay dying in Versailles, leaving behind a mountain of debt. France was bankrupt. The national debt was over 3 billion livres. Interest alone surpassed the tax revenue. The streets were filled with starving peasants and unpaid soldiers. The regent, Philippe II, needed a miracle. Enter John Law. He told the regent, "Your problem is that your money is stagnant. Let me create a bank that issues paper notes, backed by the credit of the state. We will stimulate trade and make France wealthy, not with gold, but with confidence. Traditionalists called it black magic, but Law understood that value is a collective hallucination. Gold only has value because we agree it does. The Duke of Orleans decided to take the ultimate gamble and gave Law the keys to the French economy. In May 1716, Law established the Banque Générale. He convinced the regent to decree that all taxes must be paid in these new paper notes. Instantly, Law created universal demand for his alchemy. People began to trust paper more than clipped metal coins. Credit began to flow, and the economy suddenly had a pulse. Law moved to a grand hotel on Rue Quincampoix and became the god of finance. But a bank wasn't enough to erase 3 billion livres. He needed a dream so big no one would ask if it was real. He turned to the west, Louisiana. Rumors of emerald mountains and gold rivers filled Paris. Law took control of the Mississippi Company, merged the national debt with the colony's potential, and offered people the chance to trade useless bonds for shares in the future. Law flooded Paris with propaganda showing Native Americans trading gold for trinkets. He marched 800 beggars through the streets, claiming they were off to mine endless riches. Perception was everything. In late 1718, the frenzy began. Shares set at 500 livres rose to 10,000. Rue Quincampoix became a scene of madness. People were crushed to death in the press. A hunchback made 150,000 livres just by letting traders use his back as a desk. This was the birth of the word millionaire. Law was appointed Comptroller General. But beneath the surface, the mathematics were failing. To keep prices rising, Law had to print more paper money, triggering massive inflation. Smart players began to wonder, what happens when everyone wants to change their dream back into gold at once? The beginning of the end started with a single man's pride. In early 1720, the Prince of Conti, a man of royal blood, grew furious when John Law refused to sell him shares at a discounted price. In a fit of petty revenge, the prince did the one thing that can destroy a bank. He demanded his paper be turned into metal. He sent 3 massive wagons to the doors of the Banque Royale, demanding they be filled with gold and silver in exchange for his notes. Law was terrified. He knew that while the bank had some gold, it didn't have enough to cover even a fraction of the paper in circulation. The prince got his wagons of gold, but he also sent a signal to the rest of the elite: the dream was thinning. If a prince of the blood was exiting, shouldn't everyone else? that smart money began to move. In the dead of night, carriages filled with gold bullion began to roll toward the borders of France and Holland. Law tried to stop the bleeding by decreeing that gold was no longer the primary currency, paper was. But you cannot decree trust into existence when fear has already taken root. Law's desperation turned him into a financial dictator. To protect his paper empire, he unleashed the most draconian measures Europe had ever seen. He issued a decree. It was now illegal for any citizen to own more than 500 livres in gold or silver. Anyone caught with more would have it confiscated, and half would go to the person who snitched on them. Paris turned into a city of spies. Neighbors listened at walls for the clinking of coins. Servants betrayed masters for a share of the loot. Law's searchers broke into private homes, tearing up floorboards and smashing walls in search of hidden metal. This was no longer alchemy, it was robbery. The atmosphere in Paris became toxic. The god of finance was now seen as a sorcerer who had stolen the nation's real wealth and replaced it with useless scraps of paper. The streets of Rue Quincampoix, once filled with the laughter of new millionaires, were now thick with the smell of sweat and impending violence. Law had successfully killed gold, but in doing so, he had killed the very confidence his system was built upon. By July 1720, the bubble didn't just leak, it exploded. The share price of the Mississippi Company, which had touched 10,000 livres, began a vertical drop. People realized Louisiana was a fever dream, and the paper money in their pockets was losing value by the hour. On July 17th, a crowd of 15,000 people descended on the bank at daybreak. The heat was unbearable, and the desperation was lethal. In the crush to exchange notes for whatever metal was left, 16 people were trampled or suffocated to death. The mob, carrying the bodies of the dead, marched toward the Louvre, screaming for the head of John Law. Law was trapped in his carriage, surrounded by a crowd that wanted to tear him limb from limb. His windows were smashed, his guards were beaten, and he only survived because he managed to slip into the Palais Royal through a back entrance. The man who had promised infinite wealth was now a prisoner of his own creation. The regent finally realized the game was over. John Law was stripped of his titles and his power. The great experiment had failed, leaving France with a broken economy and a generational trauma regarding paper money that would last for a century. John Law fled France in December 1720. He left as he had come, under the cover of darkness, disguised and disgraced. He took nothing with him but a single diamond ring and a few thousand livres. All his grand estates, his art collections, and his millions in shares were confiscated by the crown. For the next 9 years, He lived the life of a nomad, wandering through Europe, haunting the same gambling halls where he had started his career. He ended up in Venice, a city of masks and fading glory. He spent his final days in a small, damp apartment, playing cards for pennies with anyone who would sit with him. He died in 1729, poor, forgotten, and still convinced that he had been right all along. He blamed the people for their lack of courage, not his system for its lack of reality. John Law was the first man to realize that modern finance is a religion based on faith, but he forgot that faith can vanish as quickly as it appears. He built a cathedral of paper in a world that only understood stone, and when the wind of panic blew, the architect of chaos was buried under the ruins of his own imagination.